People make me so angry. Those people have the nerve to come in here, take the president's hospitality, and then complain in my hearing about his wife, about how Mrs. Monroe isn't a proper hostess. They complain, but they don't know about what she really is. They don't know that that poor woman has been plagued with fits and seizures all throughout this presidency. I can tell you, she had a seizure one time right in front of the fireplace, and she was seriously burned. The president and his wife try to keep that out of the public eye, but I can tell you it's true. Can she help that she is simply not as social as Mrs. Madison was? And yet they have to compare her with Mrs. Madison this, Mrs. Madison that. What they should hear is the story about what she did for Madame de Lafayette. You remember the Marquis de Lafayette, don't you? During the war, he came over as a young man, 19 years old, and folks said, he can't be any kind of a soldier, but he was. He believed in our War of Independence. And he became a fine officer, but more than that, he convinced his own government of France to send money for our cause of independence. Then, after he went back home to France, another 10 years went by, and that was when James Monroe was ambassador to France. And he and his wife, Elizabeth, were living in Paris when one day they heard that Lafayette's wife, Madame de Lafayette, had been arrested, and she was going to be sent to the guillotine, have her head cut off. Well, now, the position of ambassador to France had no power, so James Monroe had to be clever. He procured an elegant carriage, and he put Elizabeth Monroe in that carriage and sent her off to the prison. When she got there, people gathered around the carriage. Who would ride in such a thing? During the French Revolution, an elegant carriage meant you were aristocracy, and the aristocrats were the ones being sent to the guillotine. Poor Madame de Lafayette had already lost her mother and her grandmother and her sister to the guillotine. The warden of the prison came out and said, "What do you want?" And she said, "I have come to visit Madame de Lafayette." So the warden took Mrs. Monroe into the prison and left her alone. She thought, what have I done? He could put me in prison. He could send me to the guillotine. But then after a time, he came back with Madame de Lafayette, who threw herself on her knees and said, "Oh, I thought I was being summoned to the execution." Well, they just talked for a few minutes. And then Mrs. Monroe stood up and said very loudly, "I will be back to visit you again tomorrow." And then she went home, not knowing if the plan had worked. But later, they heard that the French found out about her visit. And when they found out that the Americans were interested in the Lafayettes, they did not want to upset them. They freed Madame de Lafayette. And that's the story folks should hear that complain that Mrs. Monroe isn't a proper hostess. The French say that she is la belle Américaine, the beautiful American. She speaks perfect French. She wears their fashions beautifully. She has elegant manners. And yes, she is a beautiful American. Thank you.